Well, hello everyone. We have Nathan from Digital Gnosis, and we're going to be reviewing the video "Why Does God Allow Pain and Suffering" with Cameron Bertuzzi. This could be interpreted as "Why does God allow the conjunction of pain and suffering and Cameron Bertuzzi?" which I think is a reasonable question. But that was yeah. All right, so I'll share screen.
I don't think I've seen this one before, but maybe I have. I'll have to see as we go through.
Okay.
Oh, I've not got audio if there's...
Oh.
Did you need to share the click
yeah,
the checkbox?
Yeah, I forgot.
It's right. I thought they changed it so it was ticked by default, but maybe...
Here, and today, as you know, I am talking about a very difficult subject, which is the problem of evil. And I'm going to do three different things in this message today. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to actually understand...
I have seen this one, actually.
...problem actually...
Oh, okay.
It's fine. No, we can still do it. I don't mind. Just to say, just so people know that... I can't remember the content of it, but so people know it, I'm not like... fresh to whatever Cameron's saying, whatever.
All right, wait, I haven't seen it, but I'm going to make a guess that the arguments are going to be one. So he said he's going to say three things. So I'm going to guess he's going to provide some theodicy about soul building, maybe about free will. And he's going to say that naturalism presupposes all these things, or for there to be evil, it requires there being moral agents, minds, etc. All these are unlikely on naturalism. So actually, when we consider the full facts of the case, it actually ends up supporting naturalism. That's my guess.
As far as my terrible memory of this goes, I think that's actually pretty much spot on. But I think something to bear in mind, though, is that, Cameron sort of has the plausible deniability defense here of, well, he's just delivering this to a kind of popular audience, right? So it's not representative of his secret, super sophisticated views on the topic, which, were we to engage with them, we would be utterly destroyed. So just to keep that in mind, as we kind of commentate on what he's saying, this is like supposed to be delivered to a popular audience, so maybe the level's not as high philosophically, but it's also worth keeping in mind that as he says these things, he does genuinely believe them, right? So if they're kind of really ridiculous or ludicrous or whatever, it's regardless of whether that's aimed at a low level, it's still kind of something he believes, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
Actually is. What is this problem of evil that we hear so much about, and how can we actually formulate it into an argument against the existence of God? So that's part one. Part two is we're going to look at some responses to the problem of evil, as I'll lay it out in the first section. And then third, we're going to look at a problem of evil for atheists. I think that there is actually a good argument against atheism from evil. And that one is going to be really interesting, so definitely stay tuned to the very end. And that's actually like a YouTube thing. Stay tuned to the very end of the video. I was about to say that, but I'm too much into the YouTube world. All right. So first,
well, that was really smooth.
I want to issue a trigger warning as we get into this first section. So we're going to look at some very specific cases of suffering, and these involve small children. So if you would like to leave the room now, if you don't want to hear about any particular case, it's not going to be that bad, but I just wanted to issue the trigger warning. So if anyone would like to leave at this point, that's the time to leave. The reason why I'm doing this is because...
He sort of reminds me of... what's the guy's name from The Office?
I haven't seen The Office.
I've forgotten what he's called because I've not watched it. I watched it like 10 years ago or something. But you know the guy who's like the kind of incompetent head manager, and whenever he gives speeches and stuff, it all kind of goes wrong, and he's treading on his own toes and stuff like that. Like Cameron, like, so there's going to be a trigger warning, guys. So I just wanted to say, like the kind of awkwardness and clunkiness of saying these sorts of things just reminds me of him. I think it's Michael something. Or is that the actor Michael Mann? I can't remember.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't seen the show.
Face reality. That's the first reason. The second reason why we're looking at some specific cases is because it's actually going to help us understand what this problem is.
Okay, I think that this is a good thing. Like, I think that, I mean, so you can see the way that I think like lots of Christians attempt to deflate the problem. I think Lewis referred to it as the problem of pain. It just sounds very deflationary. I mean, it's not like the problem of pain sounds like people like scrape their knees. Why does that happen? And really, the problem is like tens of thousands of kids die of like horrific diseases every day, and like there just seem to be like a near infinite number of obvious ways of improving the world. I mean, just take one example. Imagine if being burned to death was 5% less painful. Would that really be like an impossible state of affairs? And especially if someone like Cameron thinks that God finely tunes the psychophysical laws. He could just finely tune the psychophysical laws to make extreme suffering slightly less extreme. So I think that if one's a dualist, then or thinks that God designed the psychophysical laws, why not allow people to shut off instances of extreme suffering? And that's just one of many examples. But yeah.
So let's look at the first case. And this one, we've got a statistic, which is 38. According to the National Safety Council, America's leading nonprofit safety advocate, 38 children under the age of 15 die per year from heat stroke after being left in hot cars. Has anyone experienced this or had a close family member or friend who's experienced something this tragic? Well, it happens. There's a specific case that we're going to look at. His name is Juan Rodriguez, the father of one-year-old twins. He pleaded guilty in court for the deaths of his 2 children. Quote, the defendant, Juan Rodriguez, left his 1-year-old twins in the backseat of his car for 8 hours while he went to work. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark said the children were strapped in their car seats throughout the hot summer day with no windows open. He told police he dropped off his 4-year-old son Tristan at a Westchester daycare, but forgot that his twins were in the rear-facing car seats. He said he returned to the car 8 hours later and started to drive away, according to police. He drove for 2 blocks before discovering the children, foaming at the mouth and lifeless. Now, this is an example of suffering brought about by free choice or human choice, and that's going to be important a little bit later on. So this is the first example, a really terrible example. Here's another terrible example of suffering. The next figure is 227,898. 227,898. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, also known as the Boxing Day tsunami, killed an estimated 227,898 people.
You might want to skip in a second because he's going to play like the worst audio in the world clip of the tsunami coming into somewhere in Indonesia or Thailand.
Okay.
So like it's like
making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. And actually, I have a video that we're going to see of the tsunami coming in. There's a father and his kids. They're playing on the beach in Malaysia when the tsunami waves start to come in. Now, quick warning, the audio in this clip is not very good. It's kind of distorted. So just, I've warned the guys in the back, so just plug your ears if it's a little bit too. Actually think about responses to the problem of evil. There's moral evil on the one hand and natural evil on the other. So there's 2 kinds of suffering. Moral evil is suffering brought about by the free choices of humans, like in the heat stroke case. And natural evil is suffering brought about by nature, like in the tsunami case. And so when we're looking for responses to this problem, we want responses that are going to address both types of suffering. Now, another distinction that's going to be helpful here is the practical versus the theoretical problems of evil. Daniel Howard Snyder, he's a Christian philosopher, he puts it this way. He says, the practical problem is about maintaining or restoring one's relationship with God in light of the suffering one is enduring. The theoretical problem of evil is about whether evil and suffering is good reason to think that God does not exist.
This reminds me of Craig's distinction when he was talking about the problem of evil,
Yeah.
where he'll be like, on the one hand, there's the logical problem of evil, but philosophers don't take it seriously. And then on the other hand, there's the emotional problem of evil.
Yeah.
And I'll just totally leave out the evidential problem of evil, which is like the main problem of evil. But
yeah.
Yeah.
I think Cameron's gonna place some emphasis on the evidential problem, but I do think I do actually happen to think there are these separate kind of issues of thinking about the argument theoretically versus thinking about versus kind of like the argument leaving a really bad taste in our mouth, or making it, like the data making us angry or upset or whatever. And I do think we have to be able to parse those things apart. But I think that can be used as a rhetorical weapon by apologists as well. I mean, this is something I talked to Daniel Speak about when he was on my channel, because and he sort of agrees that there's this fine line, where someone might be raising how terrible these things are in order to kind of emphasize just how incompatible that is with the supposed, characterization of some deity. And that's not an emotional problem, right? That's them just highlighting how terrible these things are. And it's very easy then to make this to take this kind of like rhetorical stance of just saying, well, you've just got an emotional problem, right? It's kind of like I'm sorry you feel that way, sort of dismissing of someone's point.
Right. I mean, I think, when people object, when people are like, the emotional problem, I mean, I think it would be in many cases when people adopt a dismissive attitude towards sort of pointing out the emotional import of many of these instances of evil. I mean, it would be sort of like talking about like U.S. sanctions, for example, and like if a person was like it killed a bunch of children, like going into details about how horrible it was, they're like, well, facts don't care about your feelings. But that's right. Not right. Yeah. Like if your feelings are about how if you're sort of employing an argument that will strike people who have a reasonable range of emotions as being horrible, that does give us reasons to doubt that some scheme is perfect. I mean, if there was
And I think there's going to be an asymmetry here in the apologist reasoning, because when it comes to like arguments from beauty or design or whatever, they're going to want to emphasize, they're going to put up like pictures of mountains or something. Just look at that, isn't it awesome or whatever, and hope that the kind of seeming that impresses upon us from looking at that landscape is going to, be some evidential weight in favor of theism. And I sort of want to say, well, if that's the case one way, then the kind of seeming right of like all these horrible sufferings, whatever, is going to be some evidence in the other direction. I do think the emotions can play some role in our kind of evidential assessment.
Yeah. Oh, whoops.
Practical problem. We're experiencing the reality of suffering, and our relationship with God is strained as a result. However, in the theoretical problem, we basically just want to know if some philosophical argument succeeds or not. So one is experiential and one is philosophical. And so today we're going to focus on the philosophical problem of evil. Does suffering provide a good reason to think that God does not exist? So the first way that this has been, or one of the ways that this has been articulated by atheists, is by a guy named David Hume. And he puts the problem of evil like this. He says, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? You can tell he's kind of older with the whence. But what I want you to notice in this articulation of the problem of evil is that it's a question. But questions...
Oh, fuck you, Cameron.
This is a...
This... Oh, I... Oh, man.
No, I mean, look...
it's like a parody of himself, like...
I think that pointing that out is a really helpful way of going through life. If someone's like, where were you? You're like, look, questions, they're not arguments. Gonna need an argument. Right. Look, I mean, if you have an affair, and someone's like, why did you have an affair? You're like, look, questions are not arguments. I'm gonna need the argument put in propositional logic for why me having an affair is just asking the question. I'm sorry, that's not an argument.
So yesterday I sold some microphones I had to Emerson, and I was joking that like the conversion of 20 British pounds to dollars was like $450, and then when Emerson was like, should the conversion be that high? And I was like, well, questions aren't arguments, Emerson. Which
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to state the kind of point, right? Just because the particular linguistic way in which something is delivered happens to have a question mark on the end, it doesn't mean that it has, no content when it comes to assessing, which sets of propositions together are consistent or not. And that's exactly what Hume's doing, right? Where in that kind of short paragraph that Cameron had on screen, doesn't matter that it has a question mark on the end. He's raising a question as to the consistency of a particular characterization of theism. And I mean, that can be just as successful as any. I mean, suppose someone delivers it to you in an argument, and instead of having a question mark on the end, they say, therefore God doesn't exist. I mean, supposing you think that God doesn't exist and you disagree with the premises, why is that like more successful than someone just putting the question to you and then you answering, well, here's what I think about it and why I disagree? I mean, this is just a rhetorical point from Cameron that's completely redundant. So.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a way of like making an argument that's like pretty obvious. Like, I mean, if God existed and he was willing and able to prevent evil, then there would be no evil. There is evil. God, if he existed, would be willing and able to prevent evil. Therefore, God does not exist. I mean, like, it's just obvious what the like implicit argument is. It doesn't have to be like put in formal logic.
He's just asking. I mean, I can't remember in the exact passage. I mean, obviously, it's written as a dialogue, right, between two people. Is it Cleanthes and whatever the other one's called? And so probably in that dialogue, I think what's going to be happening is two normal people, so to speak. One of them is asking the other one a question because they're like, well, implicit in the fact that you're a theist, right? You've got something to say about this. So I'm not just going to tell you that this commits you to the non-exist. I mean, instead, I'm going to phrase it as a question because I think that these commitments are true. And so I think it's a perfectly, fine way to kind of put forward the argument, right?
Yeah. Oh.
Something I point out on my YouTube channel a lot. Asking why.
As one should.
Yeah, like that's not a good.
Very. It's like, look, I very frequently point out that it's almost like something. No, I mean, yeah. You pointed out that line in particular was like especially self-parody-ish. I point out frequently that questions are not arguments.
This is what I mean by it's like he's like. I think someone put the name Steve Carell from The Office, right? Where it's like the kind of incompetent leader character who's sort of like, as I say all the time, or whatever, and it's like something that's just completely stupid and wrong.
Yeah. And I will. So, I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen the rest of this, but I would be willing to bet that that Cameron's theodicies will not be put in, like formal logic. So, by the way, rambling English language theodicies are not arguments. If questions.
It's not an argument that God doesn't exist. And questions are just that. They're questions. They're trying to get information. Arguments, on the other hand, they assert informations. So questions get information.
Just to pause though a second, right? Firstly, questions do contain information, right? Whether either semantic information, right, for one. But the second thing is that we sort of characterize arguments as verbal disagreements, right? Or maybe ideological disagreements where we have some kind of like verbal war of words about whatever it is that we disagree about. And in that, questions play some kind of role, right, in persuading the other person of our position. And so questions are actually it's sort of like saying no individual letter or something is like an argument or something, therefore like arguments don't contain he's not quite saying that, maybe that's wrong, but it's just that questions do play a role in arguments. I mean, we've already established that, so I don't need to. It just winds me up that he can't see this,
And sometimes, and like some questions are rhetorical, so they're implicit. So the question that Hume asked, it was sort of a rhetorical. I mean, it wasn't entirely rhetorical, but it was asserting an argument. It was like it was similar to saying could there really be some reason? Like it was an argument for what implicitly an argument for why there couldn't be a reason, and it presented the dichotomy and then asked. Well, that was not a coherent sentence.
No, I get what you're saying. It's like someone might say the locution, right? Like, do we really think that if God exists, he wouldn't permit evil? Like, if like Cameron, that's plausibly a sort of sentence that Cameron might utter in this very speech. And I mean, you're not just going to turn around and say, well, look, that grammatically, that's a question, right? So, I mean, I guess there's no information in it. No, the point is that it's being put to the person who's listening to kind of like agree with the statement that's contained within the question, right? And I think that's the case with Hume. And if you do disagree, then in the case of a dialogue, you're being invited to sort of offer, you know, the reasons for which you disagree, and then the dialogue can progress, and hopefully you kind of can find those key areas of disagreement, or maybe you don't actually disagree and you should be agreeing, and there's some kind of inconsistency. I mean, it's just
This is a funny comment in the chat.
yeah.
Information. Now, why is this even important? The problem of evil is often presented as a question. Why does God allow evil? But even if you don't know the answer to that question, it doesn't follow that God does not exist. It could be the case that God exists.
Well, it might be, because implicit in it depends very much so on the context, right? But implicit in the question might be the assumption that if God were to exist, right, then he would provide people with good reasons for his permitting of evil, such that they would understand, you know, why these kind of evils exist. And so if someone asks the question, you know, why does evil exist, and there's that kind of like background assumption to the question, because people don't just lay out all of their commitments, right, which support every single statement that they're saying. There's all sorts of things that are assumed in conversations. Well, then that could be an argument, right? That could actually be a reason for them, if there's no answer that's forthcoming, that could be a reason for them to think that theism isn't true, or is less likely to be true.
Yeah, and Cameron points out that the fact that you don't know why God would allow evil, it doesn't follow from that God has no reason. But it also doesn't follow from the fact that you have that you don't reject any premise in a version of the evidential part of evil. There's precise symmetry there in that, like, I mean, it's just questions will contain implicit arguments, but there's no asymmetry in that. Like the fact that some rando, like, it doesn't follow from the fact that you don't know the reason, that there is no reason. But if it turned out that there is no possible exoneratory answer, that there's actually no reason God allows evil, that you know, there's no satisfying answer to the question of why does God allow evil, well, then it would follow that God doesn't exist.
So the real thing Cameron should be doing here, right, in the context of a conversation where someone says, you know, why does God allow evil, is asking his interlocutor the question, well, do you think that if God exists, then we would know his reasons for permitting evil, right? And whether the person answers yes or no to that is going to kind of drive where the conversation goes from there. There's not just like some one size fits all apologetic response that maneuvers around.
Yeah. The other thing is, I think that, so if it turns out that just no one can figure out a satisfactory answer to the question of why would God allow evil, well, so then that's essentially skeptical theism. But skeptical theism has a lot of problems. I have a blog post called, I think, 14 quick objections to skeptical theism, or maybe 13. But I mean, one point that's worth making is that, well, so, you know, in general, if a theory can't explain like thousands of pieces of data, that's a really big explanatory hurdle for the theory. So it's you could adopt a similar skeptical theist line, arguing that it turned out that Newtonian mechanics was correct, saying, look, it doesn't follow from the fact that we don't know why Newtonian mechanics seems to produce the wrong result. It doesn't follow from that, produce the wrong result. But if we have the smartest minds trying to figure out some explanation for some phenomena on some theory, and that theory is sort of very wide metaphysically in that it allows like these, like clever theodicies, and no one can do it successfully despite the smartest minds being trained on it. That's really good evidence that there is not, in fact, a satisfactory solution. Now, obviously, people think there are successful theodicies. I think they're wrong. And then one other brief point, and this point has been made by a lot of people, but I heard Emerson Green make it, I think, quite well in a podcast. So, you know, we have presumably God makes it so that our senses are generally reliable. But if skeptical theism is true, then God has made our moral faculties really defective in ways that lead people away from God. Like why not make it so that we are cognitively able to understand what the morally sufficient reason for evil? It would make way more people believe in God, and it would also make it so that we don't have profound moral confusion.
Yeah, the problem is it really is kind of like a blank check, right? For not just for the problem of evil, but just literally for any kind of thing any kind of datum that's going to seem incongruent with theism, right? You can just say, well, for all we know, God has reasons to, and it's not like the objection here is kind of close to the unfalsifiable, but it just kind of seems like cheating, In comparing hypotheses, we should sort of trust the one that sort of fits together with our stock of knowledge as best as possible, right? We should choose the hypothesis that does that, not the one that just kind of leaves all these blank checks for like a ton of things that it can't seem to explain, and then we just go, well, for all we know, there could be this reason that this hypothesis agrees with. Something just feels wrong about doing that.
Yeah, and the other thing is that it can be made by the atheist too. So the atheist can just say,
right.
Look, we don't know why premise one of the columns wrong, but
mysterious natural reasons.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, and I think that we have much better reason to think that, if we just compare which of the premises is more likely to be wrong, even if we can't think of a refutation, one of them being sort of complex things involving causality and theories of time, and the other one is the world is not optimally designed. When one of them has had considerably more thought in terms of trying to come up with theodicies. One of them gets into really complicated metaphysical questions that get really counterintuitive and has a lot of premises. I think that just the types of intuition that we should defer to more, if we think that, even if we, if the we don't know, but maybe there's an answer, if that's a satisfactory solution, then I think that just really favors atheism. Because, lots of I think a good example is fine tuning. We really don't know very much about the original fine tuning conditions, what parameters could have been the case, and so if you can just say, well, maybe there's some reason for it.
Yeah, it's this is the thing. The response, right, is to say, well, if theism were true, you wouldn't expect to know these hidden reasons that God has or something. But as you say, that's completely symmetrical with something the naturalists can then do, which is to say, well, look, if naturalism were true, we wouldn't expect to understand the fine tuning and how, or we wouldn't expect to understand the beginning of the universe, and so yeah, I can't tell you why I reject the Kalam or the fine tuning argument or whatever, but that's perfectly consistent with skeptical naturalism.
Yeah.
For permitting suffering, but you just don't know what those reasons are. So questions are good, but they're different from arguments. And here's an appropriate response to some.
Cameron's still in kindergarten, playing with the balls,
Yeah, drinking game for those in the audience. Drink every time Cameron just says the questions are not arguments.
But this is something that I find particularly funny about Cameron's apologetics and philosophy, right? Is that he does seemingly collect buzzwords and phrases that he can just deploy in particular circumstances. So he's got this questions in our arguments one, and it's whenever he hears something that's a question, he can just go questions in our arguments. He's laying down some Uno card or something. And the same with axiology now. It's he thinks he's uttering magic incantations or something, and then people are just trapped and bamboozled into it's really I don't know. I just find it kind of really transparent as to how he's approaching the kind of questions that he's dealing with. He's just looking for almost weapons, and it doesn't really matter about how these things clarify the kind of questions that people have or help us to understand. It's just about playing this one-dimensional chess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the way a lot of people reason about a lot of things. But it's very obvious that Cameron came to Christianity not because of the arguments, and so he's just amassed this wall. He treats arguments like soldiers rather than scouts.
Right.
So he just tries to amass arguments to win in the battlefield of ideas rather than to figure out what's true. And I mean, that's the way I think a lot of people reason about lots of things, but it's not a great guide to the truth.
Someone that is asking this type of question about suffering. You know what? Actually, I don't know the answer to that. Like that is the answer that you could give to someone who is asking a question in the form of a question, the problem of evil. So another thing to keep in mind is that the problem of evil is a very emotional subject. Questions about suffering can be very emotional. I mean, the clips that we just watched, the story about the father, this is a very emotional subject. And so when you ask a question about suffering, it can just be very emotional. And what happens if we're not careful is emotional questions can actually make us think with our hearts instead of with our brains. In a similar
Just
way,
like Pascal says, the heart has its own reasons of which reason does not know. I mean, like, this is going to cut against large swathes of reasons to be a Christian. But the second, another thing is that, like, reason itself isn't just this kind of like calculation that's completely attached from any kind of. I mean, if you look at like the cognitive science behind like reasoning and stuff like that, like the way that our emotions work is like deeply connected to the way that we reason and think about things as well. And it just seems purely rhetorical to me that Cameron's kind of like making the case. It's like the facts don't care about your feelings thing, that you see with the kind of IDW type people, where it's like, yeah, look, I'm just coldly calculating the truth, and you're over there like, just thinking with your feelings, whatever. And
I
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And I think that there are just as many countervailing emotions. So like, I mean, the Christian no doubt has this emotional attachment to continuing to believe. The notion that there are just these evils for which there's no morally sufficient reason is really depressing notion. And so the emotions cut both ways. One point that is maybe slightly off topic here, but I think it's worth making. I mean, so Joshua Green has done a lot of stuff on this, looking at what's called the dual process theory of morality. And the basic thesis is that our more emotion-fueled judgments tend to be more deontological, and our judgments that the result of careful, prolonged reflection are much more utilitarian. And I think that, if we're utilitarians, then nearly all the theodicies just evaporate. And so, if we really want to rid ourselves of emotions, not to plug utilitarians here, but then I think we would be utilitarians in turn.
There are only two things which fill me with awe, Matthew: the starry skies above me and the moral law within me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to say, as well, there was another point. Am I going to remember it about what Cameron was just saying about emotions? No, I don't think I am. So I'll say if it comes back.
Use your emotions against you. So let's watch a following clip from.
Oh yeah, I remember now. It's just to say, it's a kind of like phenomenal conservatism point, right? In the sense of the way that some things, which are some kind of instances of suffering, as we kind of either view them, like in a video or whatever, as Cameron likes to watch animals being murdered, he's told us in another video.
They look peaceful, okay?
Or whether it's, like as you go for a walk on the street, you see all the pigeons with their mangled feet or whatever, and you think, like, crikey, like what kind of a god, created a world like this? The thing is that those seemings, right, and the kind of content which is undoubtedly going to be emotional is some kind of evidence, right? Unless absent any defeaters for that seeming, right, it's going to be some kind of evidence that there is something wrong or something, something morally off about the circumstance that you're experiencing there. And so I think that I think that we actually should take those emotional seemings like seriously, or at least as evidential chips in our kind of assessment of the total evidence. Just as I think, as we walk across a beautiful mountain landscape and the beauty impresses on us, some sense of awe for the divine or something, maybe that's some evidence in the other direction as well. But I think that, our kind of seemings at this, we can't make them like really, really reified. So I don't think you can kind of like read off the seeming some like particular, whole complicated theory or whatever. But I think that the pure content of just seeing that those like pigeons with their mangled feet or whatever is like, oh man, that's evil or bad or something like that, is going to be okay.
Yeah. One other point is, I mean, I think just if you look at judgments that we make in our daily life, many of them we're just much less confident in than our judgments about like that there are that the world was imperfectly designed. So I mean, just to take the example of the war in Ukraine. I mean, no doubt our judgment that the war in Ukraine was bad, when Putin invaded Ukraine, that was bad. That's no doubt fueled by emotion. You could maybe tell the skeptical theist story about how even if it was good, maybe like Western propaganda would tell us that it's bad. But I think that there's sort of a symmetrical argument with like most bad things in the world, where you can tell this account of maybe if it turned out to be good, we wouldn't know about it because for various reasons, and we have this emotional reaction to it, but we don't take that to be very persuasive in most other contexts. So it's not clear why we would take this to be persuasive in the context of whether there are unjustified evils. By the way, playing music and petting dogs are not arguments.
Well, something about this, right, is I wish I could bring it up, but I mean, how about posting a picture of a family with a father who's just died and asking for patron donations, right? I mean, is that emotionally manipulative, Cameron? Yeah, that's something he did like a year ago, right? And it's just to say that he's as guilty of doing of emotionally manipulating people as well through his branding and other means, when it's convenient, either to try and persuade people to overstate the case for Christianity, or to get people to donate him money when it's convenient. It's just he's kind of hypocritical here in saying, well, I just don't like it when other people do it.
This building. It's old, but it has big windows and lots of light. I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Are you breaking up with me?
It's a McDonald's advert. The new Big Mac.
Slow and steady.
Translate official sudden fantasticals. Cincinnati.
I bet Cameron when he or wait, maybe it's a dog ad.
Chevy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with Chevy, did it?
Okay. I mean, it's funny.
Yeah. So Chevy, notice in this commercial, they didn't set up like why their cars are better than the other cars. They didn't argue that Chevy gets better gas mileage, that they're safer. What they want you to do is they want you to skip over all that stuff. They don't want you to think and reason and stop and slow down and actually think about what's going on. They want you to skip directly to the conclusion, I need to buy this car.
Just like on a Sunday at church, right? When they go, if like it's like, let's all collectively pray together about what we've done wrong this week. Say, look, I've sinned. I'm sorry, God, or whatever, and then just sing a hymn about like how great God is or something. I mean, what they should be doing there in the church service is actually just slowing down and going through some arguments from natural theology, seeing if anyone has any objections. I mean, this is just a bit ridiculous from Cameron to think that this is how all discourse ought to operate, right? That people should just be exchanging, like, trading like propositions with one another. Like, it's ridiculous.
That's similar what's going on when you get an emotional question about evil, is that it can bypass your reasoning and it can make you jump to a conclusion that doesn't actually follow. But what we want to do is we want to be guided.
And what about when someone sees Christ on the cross, or a beautiful depiction of something on a stained glass window, or reads the Gospels and the moral character of Jesus just brings them to tears? When Augustine hears in the kid in the garden next to him saying, pick it up and read, and he opens the Bible to a page and he just feels like a guilty sinner and cries to God. Is that wrong, right? Because it's emotional. I mean, this is just, again, gonna cut completely against so much of Christianity and turn it into this heretical evidentialism. But
and the other thing is like, so in the case of the Chevrolet commercial, well, there were neither questions nor arguments. The point was to just create an emotional attachment with it. But if it turned out that there was no satisfactory answer, So if it turned out that that there was no good answer to the question of why would God allow evil, then God does not exist, because that question of, if there were a God, God would not permit unnecessary evil. God does permit unnecessary evil, therefore God does not exist. There's no answer to the question of why does God permit evil. Then that syllogism would just sort of follow straightforwardly from it. So, asking the question, so it implies an argument, and if there was no answer, then Christianity is false. If there's no satisfactory answer, I mean, it could be there's a satisfactory answer that we don't know about, but I think that's relatively implausible.
We don't want to be guided by our emotions. So now let's turn from an articulation of the problem of evil that's based in a question. Let's now turn to one that's actually posed as an argument, because arguments from evil have been made. So this one comes.
I'm shocked that arguments from evil have been made. I thought.
Wow. What an idiot Hume is.
Yeah, no, I think. Yeah, no, I mean, the way that most atheists run the problem of evil, they'll just play this like video of like a puppy, and then they'll at the end have like just God, and then like a big red X in front of it, where it's like the Chevrolet ad, but instead of like, Chevrolet, it'll be like not God.
Yeah. I mean, this is really annoys me that Christians always do this with Hume as well. Where it's usually with miracles, right? But in this case, Cameron's just like, Hume made the basic philosophy 101 mistake of not understanding arguments. So dialogues concerning natural religion, cast it to the flames. Now let's move on to some atheist who did understand philosophy 101 and actually made an argument. Like, it's just
Hume, much like Socrates, had an irritating habit of asking questions rather than giving arguments.
Right.
Comes from a guy named William Rowe. He's an atheist philosopher, and he gives an argument that can be summarized like this. Premise 1, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering. Premise 2.
What? He said that like Craig. There is no pointless suffering. Like there was.
Well, I mean, that is what happens, right? Like, I think if you want to be an apologist, you're going to like look up to certain people who are successful, and then you're going to try to kind of imitate. I mean, it happens to atheists as well. If you look at atheist YouTubers or whatever, people try and emulate people who've been successful, like Dillahunty or Aaron Ra, or whoever else. And so I do think there's a lot of that goes on with. It's funny when you see it with Cameron, right? Like the copying Craigisms.
Yeah, I've noticed that after reading a bunch of Parfit has a bunch of very often will just have the sentence, "This is, however, false," and I've noticed that I often will have that sentence too. So
there is pointless suffering, and the conclusion just straightforwardly follows. So God does not exist. Now, this is actually a valid argument. And what I mean by that is that if both premises are true, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering, premise 1. Premise 2, there is pointless suffering. If those two premises, those two steps of the argument are true, then the conclusion that God does not exist actually is also true. And so what we want to do is we want to question whether or not these two premises are true. And the premise that I'm going to focus on, Christians actually have objected to that first premise. They think that God's existence is actually compatible with pointless suffering. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at that second premise. There is pointless suffering. Is it actually true that suffering is pointless? So what I'm going to do is we're going into section 2, where we're looking at 3 different reasons why God might have to allow suffering.
Wait, okay. I'm just going to give a few examples of suffering. Let's see if any of these exonerate the suffering, okay? So one of the examples of pointless suffering is the extra 10% of pain of being like burned alive or brutally tortured. So maybe it has to be like pretty painful, but why not make it 10% less painful? Okay, that's one. Another is the animals that have been experiencing suffering for billions of years before humans were ever alive. The fish, the like our strategist fish who have like 10 quadrillion offspring. And then most of whom lived short lives of intense suffering. That's the second one. Okay, and then I went to 5. And then the third one is, there are humans who have the desire to have sex with children. Seems like making humans without that desire would prevent a bunch of child rape, which is bad. So that seems like another instance of pointless suffering. And also it'd prevent anguish for the people who are sexually attracted.
So a couple quick caveats before we get started into these different reasons is that these reasons should not be taken in isolation. Rather, these three reasons should be taken together. And I'll reiterate that as we go along.
Cumulative
And
case.
also, the three reasons that I'm
Yeah, true.
covering today should not be thought of as exhaustive. There are other reasons that Christians have brought up and that Christians discuss in the literature on the problem of evil, but the three that I'm going to discuss are some of the most prominent reasons. So the first reason is free will. Free will. Now, free will is actually kind of difficult to define, but it's basically the idea that we aren't robots. We're not robots. We make
Cameron begs the question against compatibilism in his definition of free will.
But it's also that, I mean, why can't robots have free will? Like,
Right.
I mean, I get he's just speaking colloquially, and so it's going to be easy to, it's sort of low hanging fruit. But I just hate that all of these topics that are of interest get reduced to these kind of like apologetic aphorisms, like, oh yeah, I don't believe in free will, by which I mean I'm a robot, like, you know.
Yeah, and the other thing is, so, well, I mean, there are lots of objections, like, you know, is there free will in heaven? Does God have free will, etc.? And if he does, then it seems like we can have paradise without free will. It seems like people necessarily do what they desire to do, and there are features that go into their desire. So it seems like God could make us all just contingently never having the desire to do bad things. And, you know, there are like a wide range of bad things that no one has the desire to do. I mean, like, I mean, you know, God could just make us feel this intense disgust reaction to like doing immoral things. There are just so many ways. I mean, it seems like, you know, and then also this doesn't explain natural suffering.
And
So,
God
for example, I
himself
was
has
free-
free will. God himself has free will and only ever chooses to do the good, right? So it's clearly not like impossible for there to be a being that has free will and only ever chooses the good on theism.
Yeah. One argument that I like from this is, I think, one of the theodicies I like more from investing from it is to argue that that evils are the result of like the free will of some combination of demons, or we live in a simulation, and so it's the free will of like the programmers. And so that allows free will to explain natural evil. Now, I think that there are problems with that account, but I think that
those just push it back a tier for me. You know, because I'm still going to be asking, like, why would God give those demons free will such that they would have desires to do those things, or why, you know, like the programmer's free will in like meta reality. You know, I still want to understand that.
Well, yeah, but so much like God, see, one could make the argument that much like God gives us significant free will that allows us to do evil, that, you know, the demon world is sufficiently complex that for them to have significant abilities to exercise their will, they can do evil. Now, I think
but why is it more plausible in the demon world than our world then? You know, like,
well, because this is now explaining natural evil. So,
yeah, right. I see.
So it just reduces natural evil to a question of free will evil.
And speak with you this morning. It was within my power to refrain from coming on stage and speaking. So here are two positive aspects of free will. Has anyone seen the movie Aladdin?
That is one positive aspect.
It should be everybody. It should be everybody. So at one point in the movie Aladdin goes up to the genie, and the genie's like, hey, look, there's some things I just can't do. Even though he's all powerful, he can't make people fall in love. And so the ability to love, and this is just like the movie shows that this is a really common belief among people, is that you can't force people to fall in love. You have to actually love someone freely. And so free will actually makes the possibility of love possible. The second positive aspect of free will is that it makes self-determination possible. There's a guy who I quoted earlier, Daniel Howard Snyder. I'm going to quote him again. He's awesome. You got to look him up. For one to be self-determined is for one to be free to a significant degree with respect to the sort of person one becomes. Lacking such freedom, we could not...
I mean, just on the love point, I don't think that love does require free will necessarily. I mean, you know, like, I mean, it seems like love is like an emotion, right? And it seems like, like you don't really have a choice of whether you fall in love in general.
I'm not. I mean, I think love is going to be like a really, really highly polysemous word that has a ton of different uses, some of which aren't going to be feelings based, some of which are going to be like behaviors and actions and things,
Some are going to be
dispositions.
fact based.
And some are going to be emotions as well, like some correct uses. But even I mean, for a large number of those cases, it is unclear to me that free will plays a role. I mean, suppose the like emotional based case, right? It's not as if people kind of just volition their will to like fall out of love with someone and have like a horrible divorce, or volition their will to just be like really, really into someone either, you know. So to like when people talk about they met their partner and it was love at first, like they just saw them and they and all sorts of things changed biologically. It doesn't seem like they're voluntarily doing any of that, you know. It seems like a lot of that stuff's kind of involuntary, if anything. So I mean, like, there's a case that could be made maybe for a particular kind of love. Maybe some of the dispositions and stuff I might be describing, like sticking with someone and looking after them when they have like a terminal disease, would be a kind of like love, for example. And maybe that it arguably is like a place where you would exercise, you know, your will. But also in a lot of these cases, it's just not clear that will has anything to do with it.
Who we will become, and whether we will manifest and confirm our character through the choices that we make. Now, how this relates to suffering is that if we are free to love others and to self-determine our character, then we're also...
Hashtag existence of God.
The best argument for no. Okay. Let's see. No, it wasn't that far.
I think it was around there. But...
So free will actually makes the possibility of love possible. The second possibility
that was good.
free will is that it makes
the possibility possible. You need change to make change.
It makes the possibility of possibility possibly necessarily possible.
Who I quoted earlier, Daniel Howard Snyder, I'm going to quote him again. He's awesome. You got to look him up. For one to be it's going to hurt them temporarily, but being vaccinated is so valuable that it makes the suffering worth it. And that's kind of the idea behind free will. Is that free will makes any kind of suffering that is the result of free will, it makes it worth it. Now,
yeah, but we just don't think this, do we? I mean, like no one is arguing that we should release serial killers from prison because preserving their free will choices to murder people is so valuable that we shouldn't restrict it by putting them in cages.
Right. And the other relevant point is that God has an infinite expanse of possible options. So, you know, there are an infinite number of things that God could do. So it's not trading off, like, you know, a slightly valuable world for, like, the difference between the world where we don't have, like, you know, God could make us have infinitely good experiences. And, you know, I mean, I think most people would, you know, would trade infinitely good experiences for not having free will temporarily. And so, like, I mean, free will is, you know, valuable plausibly, but theists tend to not to justify why it's like infinitely valuable, or why it trumps all the other possible values God could actually have.
Well, there's a question here about heaven, which obviously Christians have ways of answering as well, but which is if people are just not going to be able to genuinely use their free will to like genuinely choose to like screw things up and sin in heaven or not, right? And you could say, if you say, well, they would never choose to do that, right? That's going to raise the question about, well, why isn't the world just like that now? And if you're going to say that they are going to do that, then that raises the question of how you can say that heaven is going to be like a rectification of all the kind of sin and things that are wrong and not just fall into. So there are problems with this response for like the holistic theistic theory, or Christian theory, I suppose, rather than theism.
Of free will that kind of put a question mark on this reason. The first one is that too much freedom is actually a bad thing. So my son is 4 years old. His name is Hendrix. If I were to give him the freedom to wield a kitchen knife, that would be bad on my part. I would be giving him too much freedom.
It seems like this cuts against the point he wants to make, right?
Cuts against the point?
Well, just in the sense that it's like if Cameron's going to say that there are like ranges of freedom, right? Well, then maybe he's not saying this, and he's going to go somewhere else with it. But if he's saying that there are kind of like ranges of freedom where like too much is bad and just enough is good, well, then you could say, then you can say to the theist, yes, so God should have given us less freedom such that we like wouldn't murder and rape and stuff, and that would have been better than the amount that he gave us. He gave us too much.
Right. And I mean, one thing is, it feels like often like Chris or theists probably are in their sort of like philosophical echo chamber to some degree, where like they'll just ignore like other philosophical questions. So I mean, just take the issue of well-being, of what makes people well off. So generally the three theories are hedonic theory, which says that happiness makes us well off, desire theory, so having our desires fulfilled, objective bliss theory, which says that it's a series of things like knowledge, close personal relationships, and happiness. Well, we could just imagine a world where like you would just have an infinite number of possible agents that are like maxed out in all of these. They just experience like unfathomable bliss. They have unfathomable amounts of knowledge, very close personal relationships that they can enter. They have these like vast expanded minds and the ability to cultivate deeper relationships with each other than things that we can conceive of. They have all their desires filled, etc. It's just obviously a better world. And they can have the freedom to like enter into close personal relationships without needing to have the freedom to like screw things up.
There's kind of this question of like, did God give us too much freedom? Do we have too much free will that we can use to hurt other people? So that's just one question mark on this reason. Another question mark.
I like to point out that questions are not arguments. I point that out a lot in my view.
Exactly, right? So firstly, he's cutting against his own dumbass advice at the start, right? But secondly, the thing is that, it's good. I'll say a good thing. It is good that he's at least raising these objections, but it's not clear that he actually has a sufficient response, right? And so maybe this, in fact, undoes the work that Cameron is doing, in kind of presenting his justifications, right? Because he's just like, well, I'm just going to throw that out there as a question mark, but it's like, yeah, but that undermines the kind of thesis that you just put forward. So it should leave the audience in a state of agnosticism if that's it.
Is that free will doesn't actually account for natural evil. Remember that distinction I made earlier between moral evil and natural evil. Suffering as a result of nature, free will doesn't really account for it. So we've got to turn to other reasons. The next reason is called natural law. Natural law. Let's go ahead and put up the picture of,
or as Bentham calls it, nonsense on stilts.
The house and the fire. To reason and make free choices, the world has to be predictable. We have to be able to predict the consequences of our actions. I need to know if lighting a match in a house could result in it burning to the ground. To be truly responsible for our actions, we must be able to weigh the consequences of our actions. And that requires a world that is orderly, a world that operates according to natural laws. Now, I think the best way to really see this reason in its full strength is to imagine a world of chaos.
Okay, a couple of points. One of them, you could have a world with predictable laws like gravity and stuff, where you can predict the effect of your action without needing like malaria. You could imagine just a world where like, I don't know, I mean, you set up biology such that there are like more efficient ways of weeding out disease, live longer, etc. Presumably there are predictable laws in heaven. So, and like people can predict the effect of their actions. Also like the world that I described before where people that like maxes out on objectiveless theory, hedonism, and desire fulfillment. Also, like, I think that this doesn't account for many facts about suffering, if one thinks that God finely tuned the psychophysical laws. Because, like, they're neural correlates of consciousness, but, if you're a dualist, you think that those neural correlates of consciousness don't overdetermine what the conscious state will be. And so you could just make it so that the extremes of suffering for the conscious states are like less extreme.
And also, if like something like dualism is going to be an option, right? Well, there's no reason for things to be for beings like us to kind of be embodied in the first place. You could just have kind of like solely worlds or whatever, which is still have time in some sense. There's still like regularity. Maybe there's still there's still like communication and experiences and things, but just not like spatially extended regularities and laws of nature as we understand.
Electrons in love.
The guy I quoted earlier, Daniel Hawkins, I'm going to quote him again. He says, suppose I chose to give you a flower and a big hug to express my affection, but my limbs behave so erratically that it was just as likely that my choice could result in what I intended as that I would poke you in the eye and crush you.
This just makes God sound really incompetent. Like, he can't weed out, like, malaria, flesh-eating parasites, the badness of horrific torture without, like, making it so that you can, like, you can't predict how your limbs will move.
Your ribs. Then he says, the very laws of momentum that enable you to give and receive flowers will also cause a falling boulder to crush you if you happen to be under it. And then finally, he says, in general, the sources of natural evil, which afflict non-human animals and us, disease, sickness, disasters, birth defects, and the like, are all the outworking of the natural system of which we are a part. We can go ahead. Oh, there we go. Already got it up. You guys are staying on top of it. According to June Korenega, a geophysicist at Yale University, without plate tectonics, Earth could become hot and inhospitable, a hot and inhospitable world just like Venus. But plate tectonics can also cause tsunamis that kill hundreds of thousands of people.
But God could figure out a way of making the world. I mean, this just seems like an engineering problem. But you can't pose your explanation for evil can't be an engineering problem for the greatest possible designer.
Yeah, it's not. So the problem of the surface temperature of the Earth, right, can be solved in a number of ways. Like, for example, the distance of the Earth from the sun change it, or the atmospheric composition, as we're finding out, of the Earth changes the temperature. And so there are multiple different kind of like a lot of different variables at play, which can all be kind of like changed. And that there are ways of doing it that, you know, make it so as the probability of like tsunamis that kill people is just going to be 5% less likely, or something like that, right?
Right, or make a world where, like, without like heat or cold or something.
Yeah, Solely World. Disembodies.
Yeah. I mean, there are just so many ways of doing this that seems pretty easy for a god to do.
So this is kind of the idea behind this natural law reason. Now, here's the question with natural law. Does natural law actually do enough? Does it provide a good reason why parents lost their children in the Boxing Day tsunami? And that's just something you can think about on your own. Some days I think that it is enough, some days I don't think that it's enough, but just think about it on your own. Just like in the free will example, too much free will is a bad thing. But perhaps in the case of too much regularity, there could be too much regularity, too much order in the world. So maybe God should intervene in the cases of huge tsunamis that are going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. So let's now turn to my favorite reason, which
I'm glad Karen's saying that, but it's like, why does he not accept it when this is all that atheists are saying, right? You know, like if an atheist comes up to him and said, firstly, like Cameron said, why does God not intervene when? So that's massively like cognitively dissonant with his statement of questions and arguments, because that's all the atheist is saying when they come up to him, like, yeah, why did God not intervene? Well, that's exactly all that they're saying, and so. I don't know where the hell I was going originally. Fucking hell, my head's not working. Yeah, I just think that's pretty much what the atheist is doing, right? Is they're just saying there aren't, like, I can't actually understand good reasons here, and I count that as evidence against theism. And it sounds like Cameron's just agreeing. So why do we need all this like fluff around the edges?
Yeah, I mean, so far what we have is we have no explanation. Like, neither of these two have explained any of the particular instances of evil that I gave. So far that these just are they don't evidentially cut against any of the ways I gave of improving the world. Let's see if soul building does, though I'm not optimistic.
Building. And the name of this one is actually, it'd probably be better if the name of this was changed to something like virtue acting. Virtue acting. This reason basically says that acts of virtue, like love.
Virtue acting has a really nice ring to it. I really like virtue acting rather than soul.
Love, forgiveness, compassion, sacrifice, these are worth the suffering in the world. Acts of virtue are the greatest possible goods. And just think about it for a moment. Can you think of something that is greater than these acts of love, like forgiveness, like compassion?
Yeah, like many. I mean, I think that, here's a thing that's greater than forgiveness, like the sum total of all positive experiences in human history. And God could bring about for each person way more positive experiences than the sum total of all positive experiences in human history. But I mean, in general, like, if you do bad thing, like, we don't think that it's good to like, I mean, let's say that I like just punched my brother in the face and then was like, oh, I'm so sorry, and then he forgave me. Like, him forgiving me would maybe be valuable, but it wouldn't be an overall good state of affairs. It would be better if I'd never punched him in the face. And then this also just like doesn't explain any of the specific instances of evil that I talked about.
Well, I think if you this is one of those cases, right, where there's a lot of background beliefs at play, and if you're a Christian, right, and you see these instances of forgiveness or whatever, then you're bringing to bear on your assessment of that situation all of these, all of the kind of like theological stories that include forgiveness, that extol forgiveness as like, one of these great goods. You're thinking of like God himself incarnating and dying on a cross to forgive everyone. And so you're going to look at these instances of forgiveness and think, yeah, that's really beautiful, right? That's going to determine the way that you assess those things. If you're a cold, rational utilitarian, and you're kind of viewing those situations through the light of the kind of utility calculus or whatever, well, then of course you're going to assess them sort of differently. And so it's almost like a sophisticated form of question begging, just to say, well, this one's more important or whatever, because whether or not you think it's more important is just going to be determined by like your prior commitments, and so it doesn't really have anything to like just pointing to it doesn't have that much to bear on
right. But I think that if we consult, so I mean, obviously, from utilitarianism, none of these theodicies make any sense. But if we just consult the common sense intuition and we ask, like, okay, was the ability to do the Holocaust, which resulted in the carrying out of the Holocaust, is that really worth like the forgiveness after the Holocaust?
Well, I mean, but Swinburne or someone, right? Swinburne like legitimately does say yes, and like I mean, there's something about that that's off to me, but I can understand how, as a theist, that sort of like just determines the way that he evaluates that, whereas I don't know, I just sort of don't.
I mean, there's that like crazy Swinburne quote that's like, if one fewer person had died in like Hiroshima, that would be one fewer person for whom we could feel forgiveness. But I mean, our forgiveness is not like susceptible to like the marginal person. It's not like our forgiveness like scales proportionally to the number of people. But also, this does nothing to explain, animal suffering that's been going on for millions of years. Does nothing to explain why we don't make like painful deaths slightly less painful, and so on.
And notice, suffering is actually necessary to do these acts of virtue. It's necessary. Has anyone seen the movie Endgame in here? It's probably going to be mainly young people. Endgame. So this is a movie where a guy named Tony Stark, he sacrificed himself for who knows how many people, billions of people. He sacrificed himself. He endured quite a bit of suffering. The point, though, is...
Oh, wait. Yeah, one other point that, if it's true that like the harms of the benefits of forgiveness and such are worth like sinning, then it seems like we should just like constantly like do bad things just so
that grace might abound, as Paul says.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that just does seem to be the entailment of that view.
Well, that's why Paul says the law was given to the Jews, right? He says the law was given to the Jews, sort of so that this kind of like sin would be made worse, so grace could abound even more in God's kind of rescuing through Jesus.
Yeah.
That acting out virtue literally entails or requires suffering. We're about to turn to a video. In the video we're about to watch, we're going to witness one of the greatest acts of virtue that anyone can ever do. And this always gives me chills every time I watch this. It's a movie, or not a movie. It's a clip about radical forgiveness. Let's watch.
Radical forgiveness.
An emotional courtroom as the victim's father took the stand, his impact statement offering a lesson in forgiveness.
I blame the devil, who misguided you and misleading you to do such a horrible crime. No, I don't blame you. I'm not angry at all.
Robert was sentenced to 31 years for his role in the killing of Salahuddin Jitmud. Officials say Robert came up with a plan to rob the pizza delivery driver. Jitmud was stabbed to death at an apartment on Trent Circle in April of 2015.
I forgive you on behalf of Salahuddin and his mother on the act of involving to kill you.
The judge, also overcome with emotion, called for a recess. only to return to another heartfelt statement, this time from the suspect himself.
This doesn't make it. Well, I thank you for your forgiveness.
There was only uncontrollable sobbing as Relford and Jitmoot's father embraced one another, proving that sometimes kindness does prevail. Covering the news in Lexington, Lindsay Piercy, LEX 18 News.
Every time I watch this clip, I just want to like stop and just think about how
God
awesome
is going to
that
send both of them to hell
So
for
valuable.
being Muslims.
But I mean, so that that is a really like inspiring clip. But is it worth the guy, like the son, getting stabbed to death?
Yeah, and I do think there's sort of, I still think it is somewhat sort of manipulative. I mean, I imagine that the guy who killed the other guy probably, I'm coming up with these reasons, so I could be wrong, but probably isn't in the best like economic situation. Probably wasn't raised in the best circumstances and so forth. In order to lead to him like to commit this crime in the first place, and then something went wrong, and he ended up something went wrong in the kind of crime he was trying to commit, and that's why he ended up killing the guy, even though he didn't kind of intend on doing it. But this has had like a traumatic kind of emotional impact on him. So then I kind of view it as manipulative, right, for the other guy to use it as an evangelism sort of tool to then impress his religion on the person in this state of like guilt and vulnerability, such that the other guy was sort of in a position to accept any kind of random crap that he was being sold. Like I think that the forgiveness aspect of it is a beautiful thing, but it does seem very much like the other person's almost being used as a means to an end by the guy to kind of like bring him as a convert into the religion. So I do have conflicted feelings about that case.
I don't know.
These acts of love like this. Let's now turn and talk about what the Bible has to say about virtue. In Romans 5,
the Bible.
3-4, it says this: "We rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope."
Wait, okay, I mean, I feel like I have a broken record here, but like, so I feel like maybe this. I don't think that this can explain like much evil, but maybe it explains some. But there are just so many instances of evil that it just so clearly doesn't explain. I mean, just the like torture of animals for billions of years, the just how bad extreme suffering is, and like, I mean, if I sort of refuse the point, but just none of this explains any of this. So this is actually just no evidence. It's zero evidence against a specific instance of evil I gave. Now maybe he only wants to address some evil, but this just doesn't seem to address the difficult cases.
Well, there are theological ways of reading scripture and this passage, of course, which have application to today. But it is worth bearing in mind that, like, Paul's specifically writing this letter to an early community of Christians in Rome to sort of encourage them to kind of like fund his missionary adventures and so on. And he's also writing to them in this particular part of Romans. He's trying to kind of like encourage them to deal with the persecution that they're facing in Rome, right? And this is aimed at a very particular kind of context and stuff. Now, you can make an argument that, well, for us today as religious Christians reading the Bible, like we get kind of like different meanings and stuff out of the text, even though they were aimed at a particular cultural time and place and set of historical events. But I mean, it's not clear that Paul has in mind like some kind of theodicy or something in writing this specific part. He's kind of just talking about how they should view their current persecution by the Romans.
Yeah. By the way, Romans 5:3-4 is not an argument, and I have to remind people of that frequently on my channel. But there are no premises. No, it's not clear which premise that POE is being rejected.
The Bible says we're literally supposed to rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces character. It produces hope. Now, despite the reasons that we've covered so far,
but like being burned alive doesn't.
And also that seems even more. I mean, Cameron's interpretation. So I'm not saying that this is what the Bible says, but I'm saying the problem with Cameron's interpretation here is it seems to make Christianity even more abhorrent, right? Because it's saying that, well, actually, how you ought to behave when one of your fellow Christians is like diagnosed with terminal cancer or something is you ought to rejoice, right? Or when, you know, like when your children, when someone from church's child like has bone cancer or is like, you know, they've fallen off their bike and smashed their head, you should be rejoicing together. If you take what Cameron's theological interpretation here seriously, and that's just clearly absurd.
Yeah. There was one other point I was going to make. What was it? I don't remember.
That some cases of suffering nevertheless remain utterly mysterious. And in these cases, I think it's actually best to exercise humility. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, that's a guy you definitely need to look up if you've never heard of him. Alvin Plantinga.
He says this like about, I hate the name dropping, you know, it's like it's like, by the way, I'm on the in-group, I know all these names and things. Like,
I don't mind the name dropping. I particularly, because there was a point to it, just of like, hey, you know, look up Alvin Plantinga. You know, then maybe it's a defense mechanism because I think I name drop sometimes.
Well, maybe the way I'm interpreting it, and I could be wrong, is that Cameron's doing it to present himself as some kind of like, to present his public profile as capturing Christianity trademark. Is like, I'm on the in-group with these guys and I know all this stuff, and like having watched a significant number of like Cameron's videos and him talking, and I know he's neither in the in-group, right, with all these philosophers, and he also isn't actually really aware in much depth of the kind of philosophy that's out there and of what people have to say about like things like the problem of evil. He's kind of aware of a few sort of more mainstream apologists and so on, and so I sort of dislike that he's trying to present his profile to the audience as being this, because I'm like, well, it just isn't that, right? But that's a separate.
Yeah, Nathan, did you see the video of Alvin Plantinga, of like him like getting his heater fixed on like a local news station? For those, you know, to quote a wise man, you know, for those of you who haven't looked at Alvin Plantinga gets heater fixed on local news media or something, you should definitely do it. It's very funny.
AC like unit.
Yeah.
It's Aquinas. That's Aquinas Calvin unit in his brain.
Yeah. And like all the comments are like, are very funny.
Given that God is omniscient, and given our very substantial limitations, it isn't at all surprising that his reasons for some of what he does or permits completely escapes us. All right, let's put the picture of Magnus Carlsen on the screen. Is there anyone?
But it seems like you have to know. It seems like you have to know what those reasons are, right, in order to assess whether those reasons are the ones that pertain to the evils or not. You know, the evils that exist in the world.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing is like, you know, I mean, Magnus Carlsen. So, I mean, so one point is like, for things that seem inexplicable, they're generally caused by constraints. So the reason why Magnus Carlsen, Magnus Carlsen has to play by a set of rules. He doesn't have unlimited power. But if he did, he could just, you know, send a tornado to knock his opponent's king over, you know. And so, and I mean, you know, I think that this applies to like all of the analogies that people give for skeptical theism, of like, you know, all of them are just because, you know, strategy gets really complicated when you're limited. And so, you know, there's the analogy that people often give of like a parent may not understand why or a child may not understand why their parent's doing the surgery, but their parents are not omnipotent. And if they were, they would just snap their fingers, make them better, and they wouldn't need the surgery. I actually gave a similar analogy about Magnus Carlsen in a college essay, but it's another story.
It's difficult to see hands with the lighting, but nobody. Okay. All right. So he's a Norwegian chess grandmaster. He's the reigning 5-time world chess champion. But if you're not into chess at all, some of the moves that a grandmaster is going to make might seem kind of puzzling to you. It might seem kind of weird. But does the fact that you don't know why they made their last moves, does that mean that they couldn't possibly have a reason for making that move?
No. But the fact that you can see them right in front of you, right, is a good reason to think that they exist and have such reasons. Like, because there's a very disanalogous line of reasoning between the case of assessing whether so if you're just looking at the chessboard, right? So this is how you make it analogous to the philosophy of religion case, is that you're just looking at the chessboard and you're trying to infer whether or not there's a person with reasons moving the chessboard, or it's just like a computer program or something, right? And that's kind of more analogous to what Cameron's trying to describe here, because the question is whether or not there is a person moving the chess pieces, right? In either case, that exists.
Right, and the other point is that even if we grant the analogy fully, this will still be very strong evidence against theism, because if you consider the possible, like, the possible arrangements of chess moves that would provoke similar bafflement in a person, the vast majority of them are so, like, if we say that Magnus Carlsen's move would be totally inexplicable to a beginner, well, the vast majority of moves that would be totally inexplicable to a beginner are not going to be the optimal set of moves, and so it'd still be decent probabilistic evidence. And then,
but this is what I'm saying is, you know, if you're just looking at the chessboard, right, and you see, say, it's the opening move, and you see one of the like central pawns move 2 spaces forward, and then what the theist is sort of saying we should do there, considering that's all the knowledge we have is that observation, is then infer that Magnus Carlsen moved it and he has reasons for doing so which we can't understand. And I'm saying that is like not an inference we should be making based off of just that.
Yeah. And I mean, another like relevant disanalogy is that with Magnus Carlsen, the moves may seem inexplicable for a little while, but like after not too long, you figure it out. If Magnus Carlsen had played 1 billion games and like they hadn't gone very well for him, and we still had no idea what he was thinking, it'd not be rational to infer that he had some master like 1 billion long game super plan.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the situation. I mean, we've just seen like horrendous suffering that seems totally inexplicable for billions of years.
So it's like you're looking at the board, right? And suppose the kind of side that you're assessing, I've forgotten what the actual term is you know, the whites, right? And all of the pawns have been taken. All of the, you know, like the castles, the knights, the bishops, the queen has been taken as well. And there's just the king on the board, and whoever's playing black has all their pieces. And then you're supposed to still infer at that point that it's Magnus Carlsen playing white, and he has reasons for what he's done that you just can't understand because he's so good. You know, he's a grandmaster at chess, right? That's kind of analogous to what's going on here. Probably.
Yeah. And one other point is that in the case of Magnus Carlsen, for a beginner, it might be hard to explain. But like, if you had the world's smartest people trying to figure out why Magnus Carlsen did a move, if none of them could figure it out, or the world's greatest chess players, the chess equivalents of Planting, Swinburne, etc., Rasmussen, well, if none of them could figure it out, then that would be really good evidence that he just made like a boneheaded move. If you have all these smart people and none of them have any idea, or even if they think that they know that why he made some subset of moves, if there are like, let's say there's like one move that he makes, and just all of the top chess players just have no idea why he made that. And they analyze the possible lines, they can't figure out any good answer to why he made that, which I think is the case for many relevant instances of evil. Well, then it would be the rational inference would just be that he made a mistake, and God can't make any mistakes. And there are also just way more examples of like evils that seem unnecessary than there are of plausibly bad chess moves. Yeah. I mean,
so this is what I mean. You've got like all the pieces taken, and you've just got, you know, the king being moved around one space at a time against like all of the other pieces, and Cameron's like, honestly, he's a genius, this guy. Like he's it's coming, he's gonna win, this is gonna be brilliant.
Well, no, I think he should have to have like one rook left, so they're like, you know, so that Cameron can be like, now most theologians recognize that there's no logical problem of having just one rook. It's still possible to win. There's just an evidential problem of having only one rook against all the other side's pieces.
Yeah, it is like that.
And now you may, as a Magnus Carlsen fan, you may be feeling sort of frightened. And you may ask, why did Magnus Carlsen do that? But remember, questions are not arguments. And that's the thing that I like to stress a lot on my channel. And also, it's important to not be emotionally biased. You know, you may be getting worried, but, you know, your emotion of fear, that's not reliable.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering that Magnus Carlsen is galaxy-brained, and we are just mere spectators of a chess event. So Magnus Carlsen, for all we know, has reasons which we cannot fathom as to why he would play this strategy.
Yeah.
And it also makes it makes us better players over time to observe this game being played by Magnus.
Yeah. And, you know, losing the chess game is the most important. Because then you can, you know, go back to the drawing board and improve. And that results in the best chess.
And acknowledge that you don't know everything. Isaiah 55, 8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Now, while
Magnus
I personally
with his one pawn.
that the reasons that I covered can actually account for any case of suffering, it wouldn't be surprising that some cases of suffering have justifying reasons.
I feel like the analogy that Cameron should have gone for was Alpha Zero, because Alpha Zero, when it hit the stage, it played chess like very differently from how chess had been played. It like made a bunch of sacrifices, and, you know, its moves were often baffling, but it was just, you know, it beat the top chess engines. And so it was described by one person as playing chess like an alien, which I thought was a nice illustration.
Like a god.
Though that actually is, I think, one sort of useful point when thinking about issues. Like, you know, given that what we see in lots of domains is that the best best people in those domains often will make sort of surprising and counterintuitive choices. It's not surprising that that the answers to some philosophical problems will sometimes be surprising and counterintuitive. And so, you know, it just turns out that the way to play perfect moral chess is to kill people and harvest their organs. That's what we should expect. It's not a counterexample to utilitarianism.
Just far beyond our ability to understand. And after all, God's ways, as we see in Isaiah, God's ways are far higher than our ways. His intellect is infinitely greater than our own. When it comes to the problem of evil, we should be ready to exercise some humility. All right, the last section. Let's move on to the last section. We'll move through this one pretty quickly. Is there a problem of evil for atheists? I think the answer is yes. And it's probably going to be in a form that you haven't seen before. So we are optimists. Most people are optimistic about the world, including atheists. And by an optimist, I mean something very, very specific. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful.
So I would not be an optimist so it depends on what you mean. So I think that the world has up until this point been overall bad, but I think that the future makes it. Yeah. So I am an optimist in the sense that I think the future will be good.
That's also how I think about optimism. I don't think about it in this way, like as in it presently is. I think it's like an outlook in terms of like dispositions to act going forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and I mean, I think that I think that they're just very most people, if they're optimists, in the sense that they think the world is currently overall good, I think that that's just because they haven't really considered wild animal suffering very much. I mean, like, you just have like quadrillions of animals living in short lives of intense suffering. That just seems to obviously dwarf other consideration.
That we live in it. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful that we live in it. Here's a quote from a famous atheist, Richard Dawkins. He says, quote, "We have cause to give thanks for our highly improbable existence and the law-like evolutionary processes that gave rise to it. Such gratitude is not owed to or to be directed towards anyone or anything."
I guess I just don't feel
Nevertheless,
that way.
he does have this sort of optimistic.
I mean, like if
take.
I wasn't alive, right? If I didn't exist, it's not as if I would be kind of like regretting that those laws or something hadn't brought me about and that they didn't exist, such that I like should be grateful that they have brought me about or something.
Well, no, I would disagree with that. Even though if you didn't exist, you wouldn't be sad about it. You can still be happy about it now that you do exist. So, much if someone entered you in the lottery without your knowledge and you won the lottery, if you didn't win the lottery, you wouldn't be sad about it. But if you didn't, you'd be happy about it.
I think I'm echoing, by the way. Back for you, I can hear myself. I'm not sure what's going on. I can try and unmute myself. No, I can hear myself back. I don't know. Yeah, it's better. It's fine when you were muted, I think. Oh yeah, it's okay now as well, actually. Yeah. So I guess what I mean is, so take your lottery example, right? I agree. I'd be like, oh, that's a good thing. But I wouldn't sort of be like grateful that the lottery exists or something like that. It just, I don't know.
If you won the lottery, it makes sense to be grateful that the lottery exists.
I think I'd be happy that I'd won, but I wouldn't be grateful that the lottery exists at all or something.
I don't know. Yeah, and it would also depend on whether you think the lottery is good overall.
Yeah, maybe that's what is driving my like. I don't know if I'd be grateful that the lottery just exists, like as a thing. I don't know.
Yeah. I only object to what you're saying if you are adopting a view that's like we're not better off for existing, as even if we have a good life relative to non-existence. I think.
Yeah, I'm not making like this kind of sort of anti-natalist type, type argument or something. I'm just saying that I don't actually know either way, right? Like, I don't actually know that it's better to exist than to have not existed. I just think that they're both sort of equally weighted as far as I'm concerned.
I don't think that that's true. So let's say that you adopt the view that we should be indifferent between exist. So just to be clear, is your view that we should rationally be indifferent between existing and living like a pretty good life and not existing?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
But it depends what you're talking about though, because I'm talking about for myself, not for. So I'm not saying other people. I perfectly well accept that other people might feel differently.
Yeah, well, so now let's consider a different scenario. So if you say let's say a person, it's right. Let's say that you have equal moral reason to create a person with 100 utility and a person with 0 utility, and not a person with 0 utility and no person at all. Then we say you also have equal reason to create a person with 200 utility and a person with 0 and create no person. Well, then by transitivity, it would be equally good to create a person with 100 utility or 200 utility. But it seems like it would be better to create a person with a really, really good life, twice as good of a life as another person, than a person with only an okay life.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not sure about that. What was the transitivity between? Sorry.
So the transitivity is, so if we say that not bringing a person into existence is just as good as creating a person with 100 utility. And we also say that not creating a person just as good as creating a person.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay.
And
yeah, you're saying they're all just as good, but then you're also saying that the 200 is better than the 100, and so that's the inconsistency, right? Yeah, maybe you're right about that. And there is inconsistency there. I'd have to think about it more as to.
For those who are interested, you can read my 5-part series, Long Termism is Cracked, on benthams.substack.com. Once again, that's benthams.substack.com, your go-to place for
The thing is, I could, I could end up just rejecting, right, that 200 utility is better than 100 utility, and that would be a way of dealing with that. I'm not saying that's where I'll think about it and see where it's kind of coming from. But.
So I'll just say very briefly, but that runs into the problem of like, so let's say, so that runs into a problem about that it makes it so that actions that would improve the future don't end up being good. So like, if we take action on climate change that will make the future better, that will change the future people. But if you say that we have no reason to prefer people create a person with a great life and a person with a mediocre life, given that people won't be the same, then we have no reason to act on climate change.
Yeah. No, I agree that forks the road, right, in terms of just complete sort of nihilism and sort of acting in accordance with things that we think are good and so forth now. So
yeah,
I'll think about it.
The world. Now, the question is this: how can one maintain optimism in the face of so much suffering in the world? Given the 3 reasons that I outlined just now, theists, or people that believe in God, are in a much better position to maintain optimism than atheists. If God exists, not only is there a loving being at the foundation of all reality, every case of suffering serves some greater purpose. But what can an atheist actually appeal to? Can they appeal to greater purposes? No. On atheism, all that exists is material reality. They got nothing. They got nothing. And so
that is not an entailment of atheism. And that is something that I would reject, actually.
And that's something, Cameron's kind of improving the discourse, right? But they got nothing, like when he doesn't even understand the position he's arguing with, is just, unhelpful.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is, like, on theism, it would be really surprising that the world would be such that on atheism we would rationally think that the world is bad overall.
I'm gonna have to go, by the way, Matthew. So sorry about that.
Okay, no worries. Cool. All right. Let's see. For those in the chat, should we keep going? Or
I think you should. You can play it out. There's only 10 or so minutes, and I think 3 to 5 minutes at the end is just kind of fluff of him talking about capturing Christianity and selling stuff or whatever. So
yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks for doing this, Nathan. It was
no problem. See you around.
Right.
So theists are in a much better position to maintain optimism than their atheist counter.
Okay, that's true, but I think that many that just there was some Shelley Kagan quote about that's not a reductio to the theory, that just is the theory. So if it turns out that atheists don't have a good reason to maintain optimism, it doesn't seem like we have a reason to maintain optimism independent of the it doesn't seem like there's this intuition that we should maintain optimism independently of the specific things that give us reason on atheism to think that optimism is an accurate assessment of things.
For parts. And I will close now with a quote from my favorite, or one of my favorite philosophers, Richard Swinburne.
Yeah.
It is important what an agent does. It is more important what an agent does than what happens.
Here, I'll do my Swinburne impression. Well, which is to say, it is more important what an agent does.
To him. Again, from Richard Swinburne. And this is my YouTube channel. You guys can actually pull out your phones right now. Look up Capturing Christianity. It's okay to pull out your phones in church. Capturing Christianity. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. I went a little bit longer than we planned. Do we have time for Q&A? Okay. All right, so we're about to do some Q&A now. Oh, thank you guys for that. The talk is now over. Thank you.
All right, so we have had a few questions come in. If you have questions, go ahead and text them in. The number's on the screen. Let's see, first question. I have a nephew who was raised in church, but like many these days, is very anti-church, to the point of extremely heated arguments. One Easter, our discussion led to the worst family Easter ever. This results in me wanting to avoid future family gatherings with him to prevent further pain and division. What should be my approach?
This is a great question, and I wish they would have been here on Friday night, because this is...
Expose the intellectual side of Christianity. This person should just start being well, look, nephew, account for propositions, okay? Yeah, what's your account of psychophysical harmony on your godless worldview?
This is exactly what I talked about on Friday night. On Friday night, it was how to share your faith with skeptics. And one of the points that I made, the very first point that I made, was that you have to love people. Now, my brother, if you don't know my story, my brother became an atheist about 10 years ago. And that sent me on a journey into apologetics. And what I wanted to do, apologetics is just giving a rational defense of your faith. If you've never heard that term before. What I wanted to do, I found all sorts of evidence and arguments in favor of Christianity. When I discovered all of this, all I wanted
150 plus arguments
to do was talk to him. And I even told him at one point, I was like, look, this is never going away. We're going to be arguing about this for the rest of our lives, is what I told him. That was really silly of me to do actually at the time. But what I discovered eventually, after having the same exact experience, where I think it was on Thanksgiving one year, it was a terrible conversation, terrible time, where we got into a heated argument over dinner, and it was terrible. So what I did was I changed my strategy. Instead of having some I was going into every conversation with my brother with the ulterior motive of I'm going to turn this into like a discussion about apologetics, about some argument for the existence of God. That was my ulterior motive in every single conversation. And what changed things finally was that I got rid of that ulterior motive, and my motive changed from that to just loving him. And I just focused on every interaction with him. I was loving him instead of trying to beat him up with an argument or show him how silly his beliefs were. Instead, I was going in and I was loving him. And that took a few years for us to actually then build back up a relationship after our relationship was founded on, or it wasn't founded on this, but it was bad for quite a while when I was going in with this ulterior motive. But when I went in with the motive of love, everything started to change. So that's what I would suggest to this person is change your motives, go in pure, stop having these ulterior motives, trying to have these conversations with somebody, just go in with love and then let it happen organically.
I think that's good advice.
Okay. In your interaction with scholars on this topic, are there any of them who have gone deep on the subject of Satan? Who are they? What do they say? Since the New Testament attributes some suffering to Satan and demons.
No, I have not actually looked into that. So this would actually be a good research topic for whoever this question is. Look into it. Yeah, look into it yourself and see if there are any scholars that have written on that subject. But I personally have not. So.
All right. How could God allow everyone who isn't a Christian to go to hell? Easy questions today.
Yeah, easy questions. Repeat the question one more time for me.
Sure.
How could God
allow everyone who isn't a Christian to go to hell?
By the way,
there's so many different things. Well, how do I whittle this down into like a minute? So first of all, the Christian view of condemnation is not like you're not condemned if you haven't heard the gospel. I actually played a clip on Friday where I asked Wayne Lane Craig a similar question. It's like, what do you do about the person who's never heard the gospel? Are they just like destined to go to hell? Like, how is that fair? And so his answer was basically that, no, that's not the Christian view of condemnation. The Christian view of condemnation is that we condemn ourselves based on the light that we have. And so that is how we are actually condemned to hell, is that we condemn ourselves. And so that's how it's fair. It's not that it's not this situation where God is just punishing people that haven't heard. Rather, we condemn ourselves, as it says in Romans 1 and 2. And so I think there's much more to say on this topic, but I'm going to just leave it there. So I'll suggest people go look into that subject a little bit deeper.
Okay.
Well, that was no explanation. Well, yeah, I mean, but if that's true, then missionaries are just damning all these people down.
Atheists who are pessimistic about the world, that the world is terrible and we shouldn't want to live here because it's so full of suffering like lifelong depression.
Yeah, so in that case, this version of the problem of evil would not work on that atheist. So you have to find an atheist that is also an optimist for this argument to work. So basically, no dice for that person.
The thing is, like, I'm an optimist if and only if I think that we have good reason to think that the world is good. But if it turns out that I'm an atheist and we don't, well, then I would just abandon my optimism in the sense that we define.
All right. Looks like we have time for maybe one more question.
Okay.
What are your top 3 books and resources to further read on this topic?
Top 3. There is one. I'll just recommend one. Okay, and that's because of all the books that I've read, it's by far and away the best. And that is a book called The Problem. And now I've forgot the name of the book. It's about animal suffering. The title of the book still escaping me. It's by Trent Doherty, is the guy who actually wrote the book. The Problem of Animal Suffering, something along those lines, where he basically gives a reason why God allows so much animal suffering in the world. But in turn, it also explains why humans suffer as well, because we are, after all, a type of animal. But the book, The Problem of Animal Pain, something like that, if it's so bad for not knowing the title of it.
The Problem of Animal Pain.
There it is. I got it right. The Problem of Animal Pain by Trent Doherty. Highly recommended. Now, this one is a little bit on the technical side, so it does require a little bit more working through. But if you're if you're really serious about the problem of evil and you want to know what is a really good response to this problem, you've got to do the hard work. You've got to go in and you've got to do the requisite research. And so I highly recommend that book to everybody who is really seriously interested in this question. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super.
By the way, it's me, Cam. All right. Thanks for watching, everyone. It's been fun. Yeah. Any final questions that people want to put in the chat before we end the stream? All right. Cool. Thanks for watching, everyone.